the crack came first. A sharp, splintering RACK that sliced through the quiet of my living room. For a moment, I couldn't even place the sound, until I saw the antique clock, my antique clock, tumbling from Daniel's careless hands and shattering against the oak floor. Fragments of gilt wood, brass gears, and the fragile glass face scattered across the carpet like bones. My heart seemed to fall with it, each shard a little piece of my history breaking apart. Daniel, my grandson, only laughed. His boyish grin, wide and oblivious, was salt on the wound. "It's just an old clock, Grandma. Don't be so dramatic." The words landed harder than the fall itself. I froze. My palms went cold, my breath snagged in my chest. I wanted to scream, to tell him that this was not just a clock. It was the last piece of work from my hands, the last testimony of a life spent repairing time itself. But my voice abandoned me. All I could hear was the hollow echo of brass gears rolling under the sofa. The room tilted. The walls with their faded floral wallpaper seemed to close in on me, trapping me between the smell of polish and dust and the sudden sting of betrayal. I tasted iron on my tongue, a metallic bitterness that felt like grief. For 68 years, I had carried many losses. My husband, gone too soon. My health, worn thin by years at the workbench, hunched under lamps repairing delicate French mantel clocks. Swiss pocket watches, rare pendulums that collectors flew across oceans to place in my care. But nothing prepared me for the sight of my grandson's laughter over the ruin of something that had outlived centuries, only to die in his hands. I bent down slowly, my knees protesting, and picked up the largest fragment. The once smooth casing now showed jagged teeth where it had split. The gold leaf I had painstakingly restored was chipped away, exposing bare wood. My fingers trembled as though I were touching a corpse. Daniel shrugged, already scrolling on his phone. "Relax, Grandma. You can always buy another." Buy another. The absurdity of it knocked the air from my lungs. Did he not understand? There were no others. Each clock I restored had a soul, a singular rhythm, a history you could feel if you pressed your ear close enough. This one had survived wars, fires, 3 generations, and with one careless laugh, it was gone. I pressed the shard against my chest, ignoring the sharp edge that nicked my palm. Pain anchored me. My heart pounded so hard it echoed louder than the silence between us. I wanted to believe it was an accident. Children break things. That's what people say. But Daniel was not a child anymore. He was 21, old enough to know better, old enough to understand value, or at least to respect it. And yet, standing there with that smirk, he looked at me as though I was the fool for caring. "Daniel," I finally whispered, my throat raw, "do you know what you've done?" He barely lifted his eyes from the glow of his screen. "It's just stuff. Don't make it a big deal. Just stuff." In that moment, I felt something fracture inside me that no glue, no careful restoration could ever mend. For years, I had been pouring love, money, and time into my family, believing it was building a bond. But standing there with the wreckage of my life's work at my feet and my grandson's laughter still ringing in my ears, I realized the truth. It wasn't only the clock that broke that night, it was the thin line of respect that held us together. As I swept the fragments into my trembling hands, I saw not just a ruined antique, but the reflection of my own exhaustion. All the years of sacrifice, all the quiet yeses, all the money sent without question, it had bought me nothing but this moment. My grandson chuckling at the ruins, my own bloodline treating my devotion as disposable. And I knew. This wasn't just a clock. This was the last straw. I knew in that splintering instant that the line between love and exploitation had been crossed, and there would be no going back. When I was younger, my life revolved around time, not the way most people meant it, not calendars or alarms or deadlines, but time in its most tangible form, the ticking heart of a clock. I apprenticed in a small restoration workshop in London in my 20s. I still remember the smell oil, brass, and the faint tang of varnish clinging to the air. My mentor, an elderly watchmaker named Mr. Price, taught me patience. Clocks don't respond to force, he used to say, his magnifying loupe perched precariously on his nose. They only respond to care. By 30, I was one of the few female horologists in the city. Collectors brought me their treasures: gilded French mantel clocks, Edwardian carriage clocks, even battered Swiss pocket watches that had been in families for generations. Once, a man flew all the way from Geneva with a broken pocket watch his grandfather had carried through World War II. I spent 2 months restoring it. When I handed it back, he pressed an envelope into my palm. 5,000, more money than I had ever earned in one job. But more than the money, it was the look in his eyes, gratitude, reverence, relief that made me proud. That was the rhythm of my life, repairing what others thought broken, bringing time back to those who thought they had lost it. When my husband died suddenly of a stroke at 46, I poured myself into the work. It kept me alive when grief might have swallowed me whole. My son, Edward, was 16 then, moody and brilliant in equal measure. I promised myself I would give him everything he needed so he wouldn't feel the emptiness I did. I kept that promise, perhaps too well. University fees came first, nearly 9,000 per year, plus rent in a cramped flat in Manchester. I took commissions I should have declined, worked through nights, my fingers raw from polishing brass. I wired him money every month, sometimes skimping on groceries to do it. Then came the car. Edward wanted a second-hand Ford to get to classes and part-time jobs. 4,200 drained from my savings in a single transaction. I remember standing at the bank counter, my hands shaking as I signed the withdrawal slip. "He needs it," I whispered to myself. Then, the credit cards. Always the credit cards. "Just this one time, Mum. Interest is killing me." One time became 2, then 10. I lost count of how many times I logged into my account and saw another 502,000 wired away. I told myself it was love. There was one object in my house that always reminded me of balance: the tall pendulum clock that stood in my hallway. I had restored it decades earlier, a 19th century piece with a walnut case and a soft resonant chime. Every night, when the house grew too quiet, I would listen to it strike the hour. It felt like a companion, steady and honest, reminding me that time never lied, even when people did. That clock became my motif, my anchor. And every time Edward asked for more, I would glance at it and think, one more sacrifice won't hurt him. I can still hear one of our conversations as clearly as if it were yesterday. "Mom, just help us this one last time," Edward said over the phone, his voice low, almost pleading. "We'll pay you back, I swear." I remember staring at the pendulum swaying behind me, its rhythm steady, hypnotic. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. "All right," I whispered, "one last time." But of course, it was never the last. As the years went by, the numbers piled up. University led to graduate school. Graduate school to a wedding lavish, expensive, more than they could afford. I paid for half of it, 12,000. The honeymoon? Another 3,500 quietly wired into his account. When their son Daniel was born, I sent money for baby clothes, a crib, then nursery fees. "It's only until we find our footing," Edward promised. But somehow, they never found it. By the time Daniel was a teenager, I had transferred over 80,000 across 2 decades. Enough to buy a second home. Enough to secure my own old age. Instead, I watched my savings dwindle while I polished clock hands in the dim light of my workbench, convincing myself that love demanded this. Sometimes I would catch myself resenting them, not in grand bursts of anger, but in quiet moments, when I skipped a doctor's appointment because I couldn't afford the specialist fee, or when I declined a friend's invitation to Italy because I didn't have travel money. Then Edward would call again. His voice always had that mixture of charm and urgency that unraveled my resolve. "Mom, Just this once. We'll pay you back. And I would hear myself say yes. The pendulum clock in the hallway never judged me. It only ticked hour after hour, patient as ever. But I began to feel like it was marking not just time, but the erosion of my dignity. I told myself stories to cope, that Edward was struggling, that I was lucky to help, that mothers were meant to give without asking anything in return. But late at night, alone with the echo of ticking, the truth pressed down on me. It wasn't help anymore, it was expectation. I had stopped being a mother in their eyes. I had become a purse that opened on command. The turning point should have come sooner, I know. There were moments like the time I asked Edward to contribute toward a leaking roof repair and he said, half joking, "Can't you just sell one of your clocks, Mom?" Or the time Daniel, barely 15 then, rolled his eyes when I gave him a modest birthday gift instead of the new phone he wanted. "Grandma's so stingy," he muttered, but I swallowed the hurt again and again. Because love makes you foolish. Because I believed that if I just gave enough, one day they would give something back, gratitude, respect, maybe even care. Looking back, I see how blind I was. Every pound transferred, every bill paid, every tear I shed over dwindling savings, each one was a brick in the wall I built myself. A wall that trapped me in the role they wanted me to play. And standing on the other side of that wall, they didn't see me anymore. They saw convenience. It is only now, after the shattering of that antique clock and the shattering of my illusions with it, that I can admit the truth plainly. I turned love into banknotes, and by the time I looked up from the ledger, there was no respect left for me to collect. That night, after the clock lay in ruins, I couldn't sleep. The house was silent except for the faint whir of the refrigerator and the hollow echo of my own heartbeat. The chair across from me was buried under a small mountain of bank statements and transfer receipts, years of numbers, names, and promises. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of tea gone cold, staring at the papers as though they were strangers I'd invited in. Rows of amounts, neat and precise, spelled out the story of my slow self-erasure. $9,000 a year for tuition, $4,200 for the car, $12,000 for the wedding, $3,500 for the honeymoon, nursery fees, credit cards. The total swam before my eyes until they blurred into one dark, accusing smear. My hands shook. I pressed them flat against the table to steady myself, feeling the cool grain of the wood under my palms. If I keep paying, I will lose what's left of my life, I thought. I want to live, not just exist. The words formed in my mind like a bell toll, deep and final. I closed my eyes and listened for the pendulum clock in the hallway, its soft, steady tick that had always comforted me. But of course it wasn't there anymore. Only silence where the rhythm used to be. I realized I had been living by that rhythm tick, give, talk, forgive. And now the clock was gone, and with it, my excuses. I pushed the bank statements aside and reached for my laptop. The glow of the screen lit my lined face in the dark like a confession booth. My fingers hovered above the keyboard, trembling. The bank's website loaded slowly, as though it too knew what I was about to do. The scheduled transfers to Edward's account were there, neat as soldiers, monthly amounts I had been sending for years. Without a second thought, I clicked cancel, one by one. Each click was like cutting a thread that had been wrapped around my chest. When the screen flashed, transfer canceled, a wave of panic surged up. What if he gets angry? What if he stops speaking to me? But then another thought rose, stronger. What if I never speak to myself again? I closed the laptop, my breath coming in shallow bursts. The kitchen felt both heavier and lighter at once. The silence pressed against me, but inside it, a small space opened, a space where my own life might fit. I stared at the phone on the table. Its screen was black, reflecting my face back at me, pale and lined, eyes tired but alive. My hand reached for it before my mind could catch up. I typed Edward's number. My thumb hovered over the call button. I could almost hear his voice already. Warm, practiced, ready to cajole or shame me into reversing my decision. My hand shook. For a moment, I wanted to put the phone down, to pretend nothing had changed. But the image of the shattered clock rose up, gears and glass glittering like ice on the floor, Daniel's laughter still echoing in my ears. I pressed C. He picked up on the second ring. Mom, it's late. Is everything okay? My throat closed, then opened again. My voice sounded unfamiliar, low and steady. Edward, listen to me. From now on, I'm not sending another penny. Not one. A pause. Mom, what are you talking about? Oh, cock. Daniel broke tonight. It wasn't just a clock. It was the last piece of my trust. I can't do this anymore. Silence crackled across the line. Then his voice hardened. Mom, don't be ridiculous. We're counting on you. I've been ridiculous for 20 years, I cut in, my hand tightening on the phone. That's over. I could hear him inhale sharply, then exhale through his nose, the way he did when he was a boy and things didn't go his way. You can't just cut us off like that. We're family. I swallowed the lump in my throat. If you loved me, you wouldn't measure me in money. Another pause. Then he said quieter, we'll talk tomorrow. The line went dead. I set the phone down, my hand still trembling. The kitchen was silent again, but the silence was different now. Not heavy, but expectant. For the first time in years, I felt like I had drawn a line that was mine. I looked at the papers on the chair, at the empty space on the wall where the pendulum clock had hung, and at my own reflection in the dark window. The woman staring back looked exhausted, yes, but also unmistakably alive. This is who I am, I thought. Not a wallet, not a lifeline. Me. I stood up and poured the cold tea into the sink. The simple act felt ceremonial, like pouring out a libation for a past life. As I turned off the kitchen light, I whispered aloud, to no one and to myself, tonight I choose me. That was the night I stopped being a walking purse. That was the night I stopped letting love be measured in bank transfers. That was the night I chose myself. The knock came 2 evenings later, loud and insistent, rattling the frosted glass of my front door. I already knew who it was. My stomach tightened, but I forced my hand steady as I reached for the handle. Edward stood there, his wife Claire beside him. Both wore polite smiles that didn't touch their eyes. The February wind pushed at their coats, making the silence between us colder. Mom, Edward began, his voice syrupy, rehearsed. We thought it would be better to talk face to face. I stepped back, letting them in. The hallway felt smaller with them inside, their perfume and cologne mixing into something cloying. I caught the faintest whiff of Claire's expensive scent, one I'd once helped pay for when their credit cards ran over. They sat at my kitchen table, the same one where I had canceled those transfers. Claire placed a folder on the table, her nails clicking against the cardboard. Edward leaned forward, resting his elbows casually. Mom, we know you've been under stress, but really cutting us off like that? It isn't fair to Daniel. He's your grandson. If you really loved him, you wouldn't let money stand between us. High twerf for ass. His words were sugar-coated, but I heard the steel beneath. I straightened in my chair, meeting his eyes. My voice didn't shake. If you loved me, you wouldn't measure me in money. The air went still. The only sound was the wind outside pressing against the old window frames. Claire cleared her throat delicately, sliding the folder toward me. We've spoken to a solicitor. This is just a simple arrangement. You sign the house over to us now, and in return, we'll make sure you're comfortable, taken care of. No more stress about bills. Her smile was a blade wrapped in velvet. I opened the folder, legal papers, lines of text in neat print, a space at the bottom waiting for my signature. My own address printed there, bold, as though it already belonged to someone else. My hand hovered above the pen lying on the table. I picked it up, held it between my fingers. The weight of it was heavier than I expected, like iron. Edward leaned closer, his voice dropping. Mom, it's the best way forward. You don't need all this space. You'll still live here, of course. We'll just manage things for you. His words twisted in the air. Manage things. Control things. Own things. I pressed the pen to the paper. For a moment, I imagined the line forming beneath my hand, my name binding me into silence forever. Then I set the pen down, deliberately, firmly. No, I said. Edward blinked. What do you mean, no? I mean, no. I will not sign this. This house is mine. My life is mine. And I'm done giving it away. His face darkened, the polite veneer cracking. Claire's smile faltered, replaced by a pinched line. Mom, Edward said, his tone sharper now, you're being unreasonable. Do you want people to think you'd leave your own grandson with nothing? Do you want us to struggle while you hoard? I slammed my hand against the table, the sound startling even me. I have given until there is nothing left of me. And still you ask for more. Enough. The room vibrated with the force of the word. Enough. The silence after stretched long. Claire tapped her nail against the folder, the sound like a clock ticking too loudly. Edward stared at me, his jaw tight. You'll regret this, he said finally, his voice low. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. No, Edward. What I regret is every time I stayed silent. Every time I said yes when my soul screamed no. But tonight, my silence has ended. The wind outside howled through the trees, rattling the loose pane in the kitchen window. For a moment, it felt as though the whole house itself was breathing with me, bracing itself against the storm inside. Claire stood abruptly, smoothing her coat. Come on, Edward, we'll sort this another way. He hesitated, his eyes still locked on mine, searching for the mother who used to bend, to break, to give. But she wasn't there anymore. I didn't look away, not once. Finally, he gathered the papers, shoving them back into the folder with a sharp snap. Without another word, they turned and left. The front door slammed, the sound reverberating through the hallway. When the echo faded, the house was quiet again. My hands trembled, but not from fear, from release. For years, my silence had been a cage. That night, it became a blade. I had been silent for so long. But that night, my silence cut clean through their manipulation, severing me from the chains they thought would hold me forever. It didn't take long after that night for the next blow to arrive. 3 days later, I found a thick envelope pushed through my letterbox. The paper was crisp, heavy, with a law firm's emblem stamped in dark ink at the corner. My name typed in bold across the front. My hand shook as I tore it open. Inside was a letter filled with sharp legal phrases: claim of misappropriation, family assets, potential litigation if resolution is not achieved. Tau. At the bottom, a threat clothed as courtesy if I did not comply, meaning if I did not sign over the house. Edward and Claire were prepared to pursue this matter vigorously in court. I sank into the hallway chair, the words blurring in front of me. My own son, taking me to court. For stealing from him? My breath came fast, shallow. The pendulum clock was gone, but in my ears I still heard a merciless ticking, louder and louder. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed in bed, staring at the ceiling until dawn. My mind ran in circles. What if they win? What if I lose the house? What if I end up with nothing? For the first time in years, fear gnawed at me so deeply I could taste it. Metallic, bitter. By morning, exhaustion had me shaking. I needed help. Real help. That's when I remembered Mr. Harris. He was a lawyer I'd once met at a local history society meeting, a man with silver hair and eyes that had seen everything but still twinkled with wit. People whispered he had been formidable in his day one of those who knew the law not as a weapon, but as a shield. I called his office, my voice breaking as I explained. Within the week, I sat in his book-lined study, the smell of old leather and paper wrapping around me like safety. After I poured everything out, he leaned back, steepling his fingers. Margaret, he said, calm and measured, I've seen schemes like this before. They're counting on intimidation, not truth. You've given freely. That is not theft. And if they want to play this in court, then we'll meet them there with evidence. Evidence. The word settled in my bones like a new rhythm. That evening, I pulled out every box, every folder, every envelope I had stored away. My dining table disappeared beneath stacks of bank statements, transfer receipts, letters, and old notebooks where I had jotted down amounts and dates. For hours, I combed through them, my pen scratching as I listed every payment. H, 9,000 for tuition, 1998 to 2001. F, 4,200 for the car, 2002. Al, 12,000 for the wedding, 2005. Anniversary fees, 2007, 2010. Trident card payoffs, countless, the ink smudging as my eyes burned with fatigue. Page after page, the list grew until the total felt monstrous. But with each entry, I felt stronger. This wasn't just money, it was proof. Proof of how far I had gone, how much I had given, how empty the promises of last time had been. In the middle of my work, the doorbell rang. I wiped my eyes and opened it to find Helen, my oldest friend, standing there with a casserole dish in her hands. "I heard what they're trying to do," she said softly. Her eyes brimmed with fury on my behalf. She set the dish down and took my hands, squeezing them hard. "You fixed clocks for decades, Margaret. Now it's time to fix your life." The words pierced me deeper than any threat Edward's lawyer had sent. I nodded, tears finally spilling, but this time not from despair, from resolve. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. Mr. Harris visited, helping me organize documents into neat files, explaining how the law viewed gifts versus assets. His calm voice steadied me. Neighbors stopped by with encouragement, small kindnesses that felt enormous. Mrs. Patel brought fresh bread. Mr. Dawson offered to testify that he'd seen me wiring money at the post office for years. For so long, I'd felt alone in my giving, trapped in a private cycle of sacrifice. Now, for the first time, I saw a community quietly forming around me. And then, one evening, as I combed through another stack of papers, I found it. A set of documents, shoved between old receipts, with my name scrawled in a signature I didn't remember writing. A shaky imitation of my hand, granting permission for Edward to handle financial matters on my behalf. For a moment, my breath caught. My skin went cold. He had forged my signature. But as I held the papers closer, the fear shifted into something sharper. Because the mistakes were obvious, the slant of the letters wrong, the date inconsistent, the ink different from my pen's, it wasn't a weapon against me. It was evidence of their desperation. I laid the forged document flat on the table, pressing my palm against it. My hand no longer trembled. My heart beat steady, almost calm. For the first time in decades, I felt the balance shift. All those years of silence, of saying yes, of opening my purse at every plea, they had mistaken it for weakness. They thought they could counterfeit not just my signature, but my soul. But they were wrong. I realized in that moment that the very false documents my son had built to trap me were, in truth, the clearest proof of his greed and my way out. I found the forged documents late at night, the lamp on my dining table burning low. The house was quiet, the only sound the scratch of my pen as I cataloged each transfer I had made to Edward over the years. At first, I thought it was just another old paper misfiled. Then I saw the signature, my name, written in a hand that mimicked mine but not well enough. The G in Margaret looped the wrong way, the C in Collins too flat. My breath caught. For a long moment, I simply stared, the air heavy around me. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into a darkness I had never wanted to believe existed. My son had forged my name. My heart pounded, but the fear didn't last long. Slowly, it gave way to clarity. If he had resorted to this, it meant he was desperate. And desperation leaves traces. I held the page under the lamp, noting every inconsistency, the ink darker than my pen's, the date written in American format when I'd always written the British way. Anyone could see it was false. I whispered into the empty room, "You've gone too far, Edward." My voice shook, but underneath was something steady, almost fierce. The next morning, I carried the documents to Mr. Harris. He adjusted his glasses, studied the pages, and gave a small, grim smile. "This," he said, "isn't just a forgery. It's evidence. Exactly what we need. Evidence." That word struck like a hammer on steel. I walked home lighter, the forged pages clutched in my hand. For the first time in decades, I wasn't the one trapped by lies. I was the one holding them. That night, as I slid the documents into a safe folder, I realized the very trap my son had built for me was the proof that would undo him. His greed had written his own confession. Once the decision was made, my life took on a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. Not the rhythm of clocks, but of preparation. Every morning, I rose early, brewed strong tea, and spread papers across the dining table. Bank transfers in neat rows. Receipts with faded ink. Notes in my own hand, cataloging each last time Edward had begged. Mr. Harris visited often, calm as ever. He guided me through what I would need to present, which details mattered most. Facts win cases, Margaret. Dates, numbers, documents. We'll build your truth piece by piece. I obeyed like an apprentice again, my pen scratching late into the night. For the first time, my meticulous habit of keeping records became a shield. But preparation wasn't just paper. It was my voice. Helen sat with me in front of the mirror one evening. She folded her arms, her face stern but kind. "Say it, Margaret. Say what you need to say." I swallowed, looked at my own reflection, and began. "I gave because I loved. I was never forced. But now they want to rewrite that love as obligation." Helen shook her head. Stronger. Again. I tried once more, louder this time. "I gave because I loved. But love is not a contract, and I will not be coerced." The words felt strange in my mouth at first, but each repetition made them firmer, sharper. By the end, I could look at my own reflection without flinching. Neighbors rallied too. Mrs. Patel promised to testify about the countless times she'd seen me at the post office sending money. Mr. Dawson offered to vouch that he'd helped carry boxes of gifts I shipped to Edward's family. Their kindness steadied me. For so long, I had felt like a fool giving in silence. Now, their voices reminded me I wasn't invisible. One evening, after hours of practice, I stood by the empty space where the pendulum clock had once hung. I closed my eyes, remembering its steady tick. I imagined it still there, not mocking me this time, but urging me forward. For years, that clock had marked my surrender. Now I decided its rhythm would mark my fight. On the eve of the trial, I laid everything out, the files stacked neatly, the forged documents clipped on top, my clothes pressed, my shoes polished. In the mirror, I saw a woman still tired, still lined with years, but no longer bent. I whispered to my reflection the way I used to whisper to the clocks I repaired. "You're ready. Steady hands, steady heart." And for the first time in a long while, I believed it. By the time dawn broke, I knew I wasn't walking into court as a victim. I was walking in as myself. Finally, fully myself. The courthouse smelled of stone and polish, a cold mixture that clung to the back of my throat. My shoes echoed against the marble floor as Mr. Harris guided me down the corridor. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though invisible weights were chained to my ankles. Inside, the courtroom loomed. Tall ceilings, pale walls, a wooden bench for the judge. The air was thick with silence. I took my place at the table beside Mr. Harris, my hands folded tightly in my lap. Across from me sat Edward and Claire, their lawyer, between them. My son avoided my eyes. Claire, however, met my gaze with a thin, triumphant smile. Then came the sound that made everyone straighten, the sharp crack of the gavel. The judge entered, robe sweeping, face unreadable. All rise. We did. My knees wobbled, but I forced them steady. This was it. The proceedings began. Edward's lawyer spoke first, his voice smooth, carrying through the room. Your Honor, this is a case of a mother unjustly withholding family assets. My client, Edward Collins, has long managed his mother's finances with her consent. We present here a signed authorization document granting him power over her estate. He lifted the forged papers, holding them aloft like a holy relic. My stomach twisted, but Mr. Harris's calm hand rested briefly on mine, a silent reminder. We have the truth. The lawyer placed the document on the evidence table. Mrs. Collins in recent months has grown erratic, canceling agreed transfers without warning, jeopardizing the well-being of her grandson Daniel. We contend that she has acted against the family's interests, despite years of financial support drawn from shared resources. Shared resources. The phrase sliced through me. My life's work, my sacrifices, reduced to something communal they felt entitled to. Mr. Harris rose slowly, deliberately. His voice, when it came, was quiet but firm. Your Honor, what we have here is not a case of theft, but of generosity twisted into expectation. My client, Margaret Collins, gave to her son freely documented gifts, not obligations. Furthermore, the so-called authorization document, he picked it up, turning it so the court could see, is a forgery, a crude one at that. The handwriting does not match Mrs. Collins's known signatures. The date is inconsistent with her record-keeping habits. Even the ink is wrong. He let the page fall back to the table with a slap. The judge raised an eyebrow. You will provide comparison. Indeed, Your Honor. Harris produced old bank forms, letters I had signed, each neat and identical in its looping strokes. Side by side, the differences screamed from the page. Even a layperson could see it. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Claire shifted uneasily. Edward's face flushed. Then it was my turn. Mrs. Collins, please take the stand. My legs felt wooden as I rose, walking to the witness box. I placed my hand on the Bible, swore my oath, and sat. The microphone loomed before me, amplifying even the sound of my breath. The opposing lawyer stepped forward. Mrs. Collins, is it not true that you have financially supported your son for decades? Yes, I answered, my voice trembling, and that you willingly transferred money, paid for his education, his wedding, his family's expenses. Yes. He pounced. Then surely, Mrs. Collins, these were not mere gifts. They established a pattern of shared responsibility, of family duty. Would you deny that? I felt my throat close, but then I heard the phantom chime of my old pendulum clock in my mind. Steady, unwavering. I straightened. I raised my son with love, not with contracts. I gave because I wanted to, not because I was forced. And I will not be forced anymore. My words rang out sharper than I expected, echoing in the hushed room. For the first time, Edward looked up at me. His eyes darted away almost instantly, shame flickering across his face. Mr. Harris approached for the cross-examination. Mrs. Collins, could you clarify for the court, did you ever intend these transfers as loans? No. Did you ever sign a document granting your son authority over your assets? No. He laid the forged papers before me. Is this your signature? I leaned forward, studying it, my hand steady. No, that is not mine. It pretends to be, but it isn't. Thank you. He turned to the judge. The defense rests. The judge leaned back, fingers steepled. He questioned both sides, his gaze sharp. He asked about the ink, the date, the signature slant. Mr. Harris answered calmly, methodically, like a clock ticking down to inevitability. The opposing lawyer blustered, but the holes were too obvious. The forgery unraveled under scrutiny. Finally, after what felt like hours, the judge struck his gavel once. This court finds no evidence of misappropriation. The documents presented by the plaintiff are invalid, being fraudulent in nature. The claims are dismissed. Mrs. Collins retains full control of her assets. The words landed like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My shoulders sagged, the weight sliding off at last. Across the room, Claire's mouth was a thin line, her face pale. Edward sat with his head bowed, unable to look at me. Mr. Harris leaned close, murmuring, "It's over, Margaret. You've won." But it didn't feel like victory in the ordinary sense. It felt like release. I stood slowly, turning to leave. My legs no longer shook. As I walked past Edward, I paused. For a moment, I wanted him to meet my eyes. He didn't. His gaze stayed fixed on the floor, as though the weight of his choices had finally pulled his head down. I stepped past him through the heavy courtroom doors into the corridor filled with light. That day, justice did more than strike a gavel. It unlocked the invisible chains that had bound me for years. When I returned home from court, the house felt eerily quiet. Not the suffocating silence I had known during years of worry, but a softer hush, like the calm that follows a storm. I set my coat on the chair, my handbag on the table, and wandered slowly into the living room. My eyes went immediately to the wall where my pendulum clock had once hung. The space was still empty, a pale rectangle of wallpaper surrounded by darker shades. For a long time, I simply stood there, staring at that blank space. It seemed to hold everything: the years I had given away, the lies I had believed, the love I had mistaken for obligation. And then, to my own surprise, I sat down and wept. Not the bitter tears I had shed before when I felt powerless and used, but tears that felt strangely clean. They ran down my cheeks freely, loosening knots in my chest I hadn't even realized were there. For the first time in many years, I was crying not because I was broken, but because I was free. That night, I didn't rush to tidy the papers still stacked on my dining table. I let them stay spread out, silent witnesses of my journey. Bank statements, receipts, forged documents, all of them were pieces of a story that had finally found its ending. I made myself tea and sat quietly with the mug warming my hands. The steam curled upward, soft and fragrant, and I realized how long it had been since I had tasted tea without it being laced with anxiety. Every sip seemed to whisper, "You survived, you endured, you are still here." Sleep did not come easily. Victory is heavy in its own way. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing echoes of the courtroom, the gavel, my own voice trembling, then steadying, the hush after the verdict. At one point, I asked myself aloud in the darkness, "I won, but am I truly free?" The words hovered, unanswered, because freedom is not given by judges or stamped on documents. Freedom is something you must choose moment after moment in the quiet of your own home. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains. It fell on the spot where the clock had once stood, and for the first time, that empty space didn't look like loss. It looked like possibility. I opened the window, and the February air was sharp but fresh. Somewhere in the distance, a bird sang. I closed my eyes, listening, and felt a strange lightness in my chest. Over the next few days, neighbors stopped by, Helen with fresh bread, Mrs. Patel with flowers, Mr. Dawson with a warm clap on the shoulder. They congratulated me, told me how proud they were, reminded me that I had stood up not just for myself, but for every older woman who had ever been treated like an endless resource. I smiled, accepted their kindness, but when the door closed behind them, I would sit again in my quiet house, alone with the emptiness that comes after a long battle, because victory doesn't erase loneliness. It doesn't mend every fracture. It only clears the space where healing can begin. One evening, I lit a candle and placed it on the windowsill where the pendulum clock once cast its shadow. I watched the flame flicker, steady and alive. In its glow, I whispered to myself, "I'm still here." The words felt like both a promise and a prayer. Looking back, I realize the trial gave me more than a legal win. It gave me a chance to confront the deepest fear I had carried all along, the fear of being abandoned if I stopped giving. But when I finally said no, when I chose myself, the world did not end. The sky did not fall. Instead, the chains broke. And I learned that sometimes the greatest victory is not in keeping your house or your savings or your possessions. Sometimes the greatest victory is reclaiming the courage you thought you had lost forever. I won the case, yes. But more importantly, I won against the fear I had been nurturing inside me all these years. The sale of my old house was quieter than I imagined. After all the battles fought within its walls, I expected drama, a pang of grief, perhaps one last fight against letting go. But when the papers were signed and the keys slid across the solicitor's desk, I felt only relief. That house had once been my pride, the place where I raised Edward, where laughter used to echo in the hallway. But over the years, it had turned into a cage, filled with memories of phone calls demanding money, arguments whispered through clenched teeth, and the hollow silence after Daniel's laugh over the broken clock. I didn't want a cage anymore, so I left. I moved to a small apartment by the Mediterranean coast. The first morning there, I opened the balcony doors and let the sea air rush in. It carried the briny scent of salt, the cry of gulls, and the shimmer of light dancing on waves. I sat with a cup of coffee in my hands, the ceramic warm against my palms, and listened to the wind chimes I had hung on the railing. Their gentle ringing replaced the relentless tick-tock that had once haunted me. Where the pendulum clock had marked years of surrender, the chimes now marked freedom. In the beginning, I felt untethered. The routines of sacrifice had been stripped away. There were no transfers to make, no phone calls to dread, no ledger of guilt to balance. For the first time in decades, my days were mine to shape. I signed up for a painting class in the town square, where the instructor insisted no one was too old to hold a brush. My first canvas was clumsy, streaks of color clashing like unfinished arguments, but I laughed, really laughed, when my classmates applauded anyway. I joined a small book club at the cafe down the street. We read novels in English and French, sometimes Spanish, stumbling through translations and laughing at ourselves. Most of all, I opened a tiny workshop near the harbor, teaching young locals the art of clock restoration. At first, only 2 students came, curious teenagers who had never seen the inside of a pendulum case. But soon word spread and my little workshop filled with eager hands and wide eyes. We worked with tools small enough to slip under fingernails, gears so delicate they could vanish if you sneezed. I taught them patience, the kind Mr. Price had once taught me. And as I spoke, I realized I wasn't just teaching them to fix clocks. I was teaching them to see value where others saw ruin. One evening, as the sun dipped into the sea, painting the horizon gold, I locked up the workshop and walked home along the shore. Children played in the sand, their laughter carried by the wind. For a fleeting second, I thought of Daniel, his laugh the night he broke my clock, sharp and careless. It still hurt. It probably always would. But now, the hurt didn't hollow me out. It passed through me like a tide receding, leaving space for peace to settle in its place. I kept very little from my old house, but I did bring one thing, a fragment of the broken clock. Just a small brass gear, sharp-edged, useless on its own. I placed it on my windowsill. Each morning, when I drink my coffee, I let the sun strike it, turning it into a tiny piece of gold. It reminds me that even from what is shattered, something can still shine. Letters from Edward arrive sometimes. At first, they were angry accusations, pleas, even veiled threats. I left them unopened in a drawer. Later, the letters softened, full of apologies mixed with excuses. I read a few, but found no truth in them, only desperation. I don't hate him. I don't think I could, even after everything. But love doesn't mean surrender anymore. Love to me now means freedom to care for myself, to choose peace, to open my heart only where it will not be trampled. Some nights I still dream of the courtroom, the weight of silence before the judge spoke, the sound of the gavel like thunder. But I no longer wake in panic. Instead, I wake with a strange calm, as though my subconscious is reminding me, you stood up, you chose yourself, you walked out free. One afternoon, Helen came to visit. She stood on my balcony, her hair whipping in the sea breeze, her eyes shining. You did it, Margaret, she said. You built a new life. I laughed softly. I fixed clocks for decades, Helen. It seems I finally fixed myself too. I think often of the pendulum clock. For years, it was my motif of endurance, of being trapped in a rhythm not of my own making. But here, with the chimes ringing in the sea wind, I understand life doesn't have to be measured by ticks and tocks. It can be measured in laughter, in sips of coffee, in brushstrokes of color on a canvas. Time is no longer a cage. It's an open horizon. Now, when people ask me about my family, I don't flinch. I tell them the truth, in my own words, that I gave until I was empty, and then I learned to fill myself again, that I lost what I thought was unbreakable and discovered something stronger in its place. Most of all, I tell them this. I lost a greedy family, but I found a peaceful life, like the closing of a book whose story has finally been told. I want to look at you now, not as a character in a story, not as a distant voice, but as one person speaking directly to another. I've carried you with me through every broken gear and every trembling decision. You've seen the pendulum swing from silence to strength, from sacrifice to freedom. And now, as I set down this chapter of my life, I want to ask you something. If one day your loved ones turn your care into a debt, will you stay silent or will you rise? It is not an easy question. I know, because I lived the silence for years. I told myself that giving was love, that patience was strength, that endurance was virtue. I let my heart become a purse that opened at every plea. But I have learned this. Love that is demanded is not love. Love that is measured in money becomes a chain. And the only way to break that chain is to choose yourself. I am not here to lecture you. I am not here to tell you what you must do. I only want to share what I found when I finally drew a line. Freedom, yes, but also peace, dignity, and a life that feels like mine again. When I stood in court and spoke the words, I will not be forced anymore, I thought my voice would crack. But instead, it grew stronger. It surprised even me. And perhaps when the day comes for you to stand for yourself, you will find your voice waiting, steadier than you expect. So let me say this simply and plainly. Thank you. Thank you for walking with me through every crack and every tick of this story. Thank you for sitting beside me at the kitchen table as I canceled transfers, for standing behind me in the courtroom as I faced down lies, for stepping onto this balcony with me now as the sea wind carries the sound of chimes. You have been my witness. And sometimes, a witness is exactly what we need to remind ourselves that we are not invisible. If you take one thing from my journey, let it be this. You deserve love, not exploitation. You deserve respect, not manipulation. You deserve a life where silence is not submission, but serenity. And if this story has touched something in you, if you have felt the sting of being used, the ache of being unseen, then I ask you, from the heart, share this story. Share it so others can see themselves in these pages. Share it so someone sitting in their own dark kitchen, staring at their own stack of receipts, might realize they are not alone. Share it so courage can spread one boundary at a time. Because every time one of us chooses to rise, it lights a path for someone else. This is my story, but it no longer belongs only to me. It belongs to every person who has ever been treated as less than they are worth, and to every soul searching for the strength to say, it's enough. And if today is not the day you rise, that's all right. Keep the thought close, like a seed in your pocket. One day, when the moment comes, you'll know. And when you stand, your silence will turn into the same blade mine did sharp enough to cut through chains. So here, at the close of my story, I leave you with one final sound. Not the tick of a clock, not the gavel of a courtroom, but the ringing of wind chimes in the Mediterranean air, soft and free. That is the music of a life reclaimed. And may it remind you that yours can be too.